happy to be joined now by Eric Gallanty, play-by-play voice for Hockey East. Eric, thanks for joining us, man.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to working with you guys this weekend and for being on the show here. Looking forward to talk some college hockey.
Yeah, Eric will be on the call for the semifinal games at TD Garden. Condolences in advance for working with Billy Jaffe, but, that's just the card you were dealt. So there you go. You got to work with Jeff. No, he's great. We always have a good time and happy to have you on the broadcast and happy to look ahead to some great games. And I got to tell you, I don't think people saw this coming. Maine, I think people saw that coming. But Northeastern beating Boston College, a huge upset. First number 9 seed that ever reached the semifinal. And Eric, I guess I'll just get your thoughts on Northeastern advancing to the semifinal, and if you could in any way see this coming.
Yeah, I mean, the crazy thing about this is, you guys were at the Bean Pot, right? And, Northeastern's been so good in the Bean Pot before, but it certainly was not the case this year. And so this isn't like one of those turnarounds where we say, okay, they were, didn't have a great start, but they've been coming recently. I mean, they got outscored 12-3 against UConn on March 1st. It's not that long ago in that 2-game series. So the fact that they've done this is kind of crazy. The one thing that probably in terms of the Boston College game is, of course, as you guys know, whenever there's a rivalry game, that kind of can change the calculus of things. And when you heard what Cameron Whitehead, the goalie, said after the game, when you heard what a couple of the other guys said, they took that Beanpot loss to BC really personally. 8-2 was the final score. So there was a lot of motivation there in terms of, they talked about it. It's a new season. They're 2-0 in the new season. And it starts with Cameron Whitehead, who you guys remember last year was really great at Beanpot. He won the Eberly Award. So it's not like he's never done this before, but still to have it's a .961 save percentage in 2 games in the Hockey East tournament is pretty crazy. So, shocking maybe isn't the right word. Certainly surprised based on where BC was and where Northeastern was this year. But there's a lot of pieces on this Northeastern team that have won these major games before. And that, kind of came through again on Saturday.
Yeah, I love that when you look at Northeastern and just how this roster is built out. You bring up Cam Whitehead, and in front of them are the guys like a Vinny Borghese, a Jake Boltman, who just transferred in, right, from Notre Dame. But then it's Jack Williams, Cam Lund, and you see especially getting the scoring from Cam Lund, and of course Connor as well, the freshman. So they're getting it from the top 6 players. But when it comes down to it, the team can be motivated. What is it about this Northeastern squad that plays on top of the puck, likes to forecheck, will play heavy, and has so deep down the middle a 200-foot game? But what made it work for them against BC that you could see it translating in a matchup with Maine where these two teams, I mean, that is going to be, not to embellish a little, it's going to be like a bloodbath watching them against the boards, which I look forward to.
Yeah, for sure. And that physical play certainly stood out. I think the thing that really stood out in that BC game was the block shots, right? They blocked 20 shots against BC. They have 47 block shots in 2 playoff games here. So they really committed to the structure. And that's where, like, you talk about the nature of the motivation that Northeastern had. It was how they committed to their game plan. And you really saw that. I mean, there were BC, I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but they had far more shot attempts, even ratio-wise, than shots on goal. Like, they just couldn't get, as much as they were kind of frantic in that third period and trying to come back, so many of their shots couldn't actually get through because of how well Northeastern was blocking shots. So that was the big thing that stood out. And then the second thing is, we talk about face-offs sometimes. I think sometimes it's a valid stat. Sometimes maybe it's a touch overrated, but Northeastern's really good on the face-off. Jack Williams, who you mentioned, takes a lot of them. Ryan McGuire takes a lot of them. And so with 27 seconds left in that game, BC got a late power play and had a chance 6-on-4, but Ryan McGuire won that face-off, and that may have actually been the biggest moment of the game. And that was a strength of Northeastern that they really relied on in that spot that, certainly can always show up. And then you talk about the main piece. Northeastern certainly has the experience winning in TD Garden, right? They've done it through the years. So that is a place that could potentially be an advantage for them as well.
All right. So you mentioned Maine. 2-0-1 against Northeastern this year. Ben Barr has this team in the semifinals again. It's been a lot of fun to sort of see Maine's reemergence in Hockey East under Barr, particularly the last couple of years. What stands out to you about the Black Bears? I know George had talked about some of their qualities, the quote, bloodbath that we could see on Thursday night at TD Garden.
Yeah, I don't want to. This is not going to sound like the most philosophical analysis. They're just good. Like, that's kind of what they are. The strength of their team is really how much depth they have. It really doesn't feel like one guy. You could talk about Alvin Boya. You could talk about some of their forwards up front, certainly, but they're just really solid. I mean, it's maybe been a little quiet this year, as crazy as that sounds with all the Boston schools, but they've only lost 2 games in regulation since January 3rd. Even in that game against Lowell, they had 7 goals. They had 13 guys with a point. 8 players had 2 points in that game. Their power play is really solid. They went through a weird stretch where they weren't scoring this year, but they just get a ton of pucks to the net. But some of those, advanced analytics, Corsi, game control, all of that stuff, Maine is top 5 in the country in almost every one of those categories. So they really control the game. The shots they allow are really from the outside, so they make it really difficult to get grade A chances. And when you do, they have one of the best goalies in the country in Alvin Boya. So they're just a really solid team. And I think the thing about them is, Adam, you mentioned the fact it was great to see them at the Garden last year. They were not satisfied with that at all. They were incredibly disappointed that they didn't get beyond that. So this is very much a, now we're back to take care of our business that we didn't get to finish last year.
Yeah, I love that. When you watched them last year, they brought it to BU, and covering that championship game, you saw the aftermath of matching up with the main team, where on BU, and that definitely had a factor in the game of legs are heavier, just going against this main attack. It's wave after wave after wave. You talk about the depth. That's what jumps out to me. But Eric, in your eyes, what's the strength of this team? Because you see McCarr and Scott combining for 33 goals, just alone goals between those two. I look at the blue line, and their experience, they're old, and then the guys that Ben Barr will start on the ice, you could say aren't their best defenders, but I don't want to misspeak on Braziel and Charbier. Look, what do you think is the strength of this team? And you talk about Alvin Boya too. So talking about all 3 parts of this squad, what to you makes Maine so good?
Yeah, it's that game control stuff, right? And that includes the blue line. You mentioned a couple of those guys. You can talk about Brandon Holt, who's really good defensively. You talk about Frank Jurasevich, who came in from Merrimack. That was a really key transfer. The other thing, Maine's just college hockey age is a little different, right? Because sometimes you have young age teams, but they could be old experience. Maine's both. They really only play one freshman who plays significant minutes, Oscar Kalmaroff. Everybody else, you're talking about a lot of upperclassmen, a lot of guys who have been around, bunch of guys who's even potentially transferred in. You mentioned McCarr, Jurasevich. There's a couple others. Harrison Scott started his career elsewhere. So there's a lot of that. It's a veteran, it's an experienced team. They understand what Ben Barr's trying to do with them structurally. They understand how to push people to the outside. So it's going to be very difficult for Northeastern, especially because they rely upon their top line so much to get the grade A chances that they want to in front of Alvin Boya.
Yeah, Frank Jurasevich, who you mentioned, first Maine defender in over a decade to reach the 25-point mark, which is pretty impressive. All right, so that's the Maine Northeastern matchup. Boston University UConn is actually the earlier game. BU in a battle with UMass, a 3-2 overtime win, so they were able to get back to the semifinal. Looking to win it for the first time since 23, so it hasn't been that long, but looking for their 11th Hockey East tournament title. We saw BU, you mentioned the Bean Pot with Boston College and thrashing Northeastern. They end up losing to BU, and I really remember watching that game and saying, man, this is all BC. BC's going to run away with it, and then all of a sudden BU just turned on the Jets. What stands out to you about the Terriers?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things with this BU team. Number one, you guys saw it at Beanpot, right? You kind of have to start with Mike Yegorov, who totally changed the course of this BU team. He's been outstanding in goal. I think most folks know the story. If they don't, He was in the USHL. He was committed to BU, but not supposed to come until next season. But he ends up coming in early. He ends up starting a game at Boston College on the road, and he's basically been the starter ever since the middle of January. But it's almost less about him and more what he's done to help BU's defense. And we naturally talk offense with BU so much, but since Yegorov started playing, which is January 25th, BU's only allowed 27 goals, and that's over 13 games. And you could even, if you want to go deeper on that stat, of those 27 goals, 11 of them came in 2 games. They've allowed 2 goals or less in 11 of their last 13. So they've just found a way to be really good defensively to then go along with all the offensive firepower that they have. And that's really been the biggest thing with this BU team in the second half of the season compared to some of the inconsistencies we saw in the first half.
Yeah, and how did you see that uptick from Yegorov? I mean, his first game in, he gets dropped into Conti form. Everyone knows how difficult that is to play. Everyone knows the storyline. And then you just saw a different BU team in the Bean Pot. From your eyes, Eric, what have you seen change about this team where it's gone from Yegorov being that guy that starts 3 games to now once he got to BU, once he arrived on campus, once he got submitted into spring semester, he's been their goalie with a .937 save percentage. Everything in front of him, you talk about the defense. How has that been benefiting the front line too, the 3 guys on top of the ice for them?
Yeah, I think it's just, confidence in what they have on the back end, right? I mean, they're trusting what they have. And I think the other piece too, which this is probably less about Yegorov, is BU was extremely young defensively early in the season. A lot of sophomores, a lot of freshmen. So there was that natural sort of growing up period as the year went on as well. But he's just been so solid back there. And I think the other thing is he just brings a personality, it feels like. He's jumping against the glass at Aganis, and you talk to him after the game at the Bean Pot, and it's like doesn't have a care in the world about how big a deal this is. He's just a great sort of personality to bring in as well. It's worth noting he was a 2nd-round pick of the Devils, so it's not completely shocking that he's been as good as he's been, even though the circumstances around it obviously were somewhat unique. But he's just brought this totally different element to this team.
In terms of the UConn, by the way, the tournament's gone to the Dogs and the Black Bear, right? So you have the Terriers and the Huskies going head to head. But UConn with a 3-1 win over Providence to advance to the semifinal game. And, second time that Mike Cavanaugh has taken the UConn Huskies to the semifinal. Obviously, they're the young guns, I guess you could say, of Hockey East, right? Because they've only been in Hockey East for about a decade or so. You called the UConn win over Providence. I want to ask you first, not necessarily looking ahead of the matchup against BU, but just the environment at the ice forum. It seemed really loud watching it on TV. What was it like in that building?
Yeah, it's a great building. It's not the biggest capacity-wise, but I think that actually helps because it's full basically every night. It worked out. Sometimes you have to get lucky in these Hockey East playoffs because it's right around spring break for a lot of the schools. Yeah. But the UConn kids were there still, so that made a huge difference. It was a great environment in a game that they were down and had to come back against, and they certainly did. It's been a pretty special year in UConn, and there's a lot of really, really great storylines with this team. We talk about a lot of them, but they get the job done in a major way. But it was just, fantastic crowd, fantastic environment.
What do you see that Muldowney and Shander bring to this UConn attack? Because Muldowney's a leading goal scorer, Shander's a leading with assists, and you see both of those guys be big-time players on the goals they needed for the comeback win against Prov at home.
Yeah, can we talk about the Shandor thing? So I want to make sure people understand what he did in that game. So he got hurt relatively early on in that game, went down the tunnel, did not play the rest of the first period. Second period, he's out there in between, during TV timeouts, he's kind of skating on the ice, trying to test his, see if he can skate. He goes out for one shift, his first shift in the second period, scores, and then that was it the rest of the game. He didn't play the rest of the game. So, I mean, talk about not to be dramatic, but it was almost like it was like a Kirk Gibson type moment. I mean, it was really crazy. And, but he's one of the captains. And this is something that, we'll talk about this week as we're preparing the storylines for this game. Mike Cavanaugh's been really consistent that the biggest turning point of their season was in June when John Spetz and Hudson Shandor decided to come back. They're so important as veterans. UConn lost a couple of guys to the transfer portal, NHL draft picks to the transfer portal, their top couple of scorers from last year. But Spetz and Shandor coming back kind of put this wanting to prove the world wrong kind of thing on this UConn team that they've really carried all the way through. You mentioned the Muldowney piece. It's really the jumps, right? Just so I have the numbers right. So Muldowney's up 28 points from last year. Shandor's up 19 points from last year. Jake Richard's up 20 points from last year. Ryan Tattle's up 18 points from. I mean, these are crazy numbers year over year. So, those are the guys that have stepped up in a massive way. Another kind of veteran team that goes along with a really good freshman class that stepped up in some key moments.
And how about the goaltending for UConn? You got the transfer from UNH, Tyler Muslik. How big has he been for this squad?
Yeah, that might be the best story of all of them. So Tyler Muslik is a national team development program goalie. So he was, had some bona fides coming into college. Went to UNH, was just kind of never really got the opportunity because he got hurt that second year, sort of lost the net to Jakob Helston, to whose credit was really good. It wasn't like that was, a crazy choice. So then Muslik tries to find a new spot and didn't necessarily really have the success in college to go off of. You're going off of past stuff with him, but he's come in. Then he got hurt again this year and missed a little bit of time. But he's come back and he's just been a really solid goalie. Callum Tung was an all Hockey East rookie team selection. He was hurt at the beginning of this season. He's come in. They've basically split time ever since, kind of the beginning of December. And Mike Cavanaugh has said, I'm not overthinking it, right? It was Muslik's turn, so he's going to go. I don't know what we're going to see on Thursday, but I wouldn't be surprised if it goes the other way. So that's kind of what he's been in goal this year. Both guys have been really, really solid. Muslik was great down the stretch of that game. He was great in the Connecticut Ice Tournament. And that's another one for UConn. I know that folks maybe in this area maybe aren't as quite aware of it as Beanpot. The Connecticut 4 schools have started playing a Beanpot-like tournament the last 4 or 5 years. And UConn had never won that. And I know it was weighing on them. And to get the monkey off their back and get a trophy winning that, I think was a big deal for this team, that if they're raising the trophy on Friday, we might be looking back at.
I love that. So if they raise that trophy, they can look back on that tournament and the momentum boost they get. Of course, BU won the Beanpot. Northeastern knows how to win tournaments. And this is Maine's second straight trip to being in the Final Four for the Hockey East tournament. We talked about the goalies. We talked about the studs on each team. Eric, in your eyes, who's the X factor in the tournament? I know it's a cliche question, but who do you see being a player that could step up and the team that can win, and this guy will be the why?
I guess the X factor of the Beanpot's Yegorov, right? And that totally changes the course of that tournament. It's probably easy to say the goalies, but I'll do it for each game, I guess. The first game, I guess it's probably Cam Whitehead, right? I mean, if he's going to keep playing like this, he's as good as any goalie in this tournament. It's a tougher matchup against Maine, but if he can keep playing like this, that's a real one. And then I think in the second game, maybe more than even one guy, it's probably the power plays, just because both power plays are so good. UConn has a power play goal in 16 of their 18 games in the second half. BU's power play's been elite, and usually when they score one, they score two. But as you guys know, in the playoffs, sometimes there's not as many penalties called in a normal game. So does the power play have a chance to be a factor? That could be really huge. The other guy, of course, that maybe we haven't touched on is Cole Hudson for Boston University, who is, just had the year that his brother had a couple of years ago as a freshman. His brother Quinn, who's still there, is second nationally in points per game. But Cole Hudson can kind of do some of those things for BU that Lane Hudson did, that we saw why he's gone on to the NHL and had the success that he's had. So that's probably a name to watch for BU. It'll be interesting to see the start of that game early because, UConn in a new building for them, first time in a while since 22, a lot of new pieces since then. So how do they handle it against a BU team that's obviously been there? But in that second game, I think it's clearly Whitehead.
All right, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this question before we let you go and wrap things up on the Hockey Hub. Boston College, number one team in the country. They lose in the Beanpot, then they lose in the quarterfinal round of the Hockey East tournament. They're stacked. They're top to bottom. Any concern about BC because of the fact they lose in that Beanpot final, they lose in this quarterfinal round? Chap, any concern going into the NCAA tournament?
This is probably not going to be as hot takey as it could be, but I thought they played fine for a lot of that game. There was about 8 minutes at the end of the second period against Northeastern where they didn't have a shot on goal. Northeastern played really well. They got 2 goals out of that. The rest of it, though, BC outshot them pretty good. Fowler allowed 2 goals. Yeah, it wasn't probably a great rebound on the first one, but Fowler's has better numbers than almost any full-time starter in Hockey East history, so it's probably not fair to go there, right? Put that on him. Leonard had, I think it was 18 shot attempts and 9 shots on goal, so it wasn't for lack of chances. I thought that the BU Beanpot game and the Northeastern game were similar in the fact of how many block shots there were, how good Northeastern was at sticking to their structure. But again, you still got to have a great goalie. And so, sure, obviously it's not a game that Boston College wanted to lose. But I don't think, outside of maybe 7 or 8 minutes, they played badly by any means. And I think, if anything, this will just motivate them going forward.